we wanted to talk about the Trump administration, your time serving in Washington, but I thought we would begin, with the economy, and just to ask you, what is your take on where the economy stands? People talk about, a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery. What's the economic outlook as you see it?
Well, where we stand as of today actually would turn out to be very little surprise. Mm-hmm. One thing I'd analyzed back in January was, what is the effect on the economy of having extra holidays and weekends? Mm-hmm. And thinking that might be an analogy to what we would do. And if you fill the full quarter full of holidays and weekends, GDP and pretty much employment, or at least hours worked, would be 30% lower. And it turns out that that's right where we are right now. We've got a lot of good data, good quality data available now, and our aggregate hours work and GDP are right about at 70% of what they normally are. What's going to happen next? In the United States, we have really an unbelievably generous unemployment rule that's in effect through the end of July that pays the majority of people more to be unemployed than they're paid in their jobs. We've never seen anything on that scale before. We've had in the previous recession, we would have maybe 4 or 5 million people in that position, and now we have tens and tens of millions of people in that position. So I don't really see the economy doing much before the end of July. It has to be a voluntary participation arrangement, and people are just not going to be interested in paying money to go to work, which is in effect what they'd be doing. After July, I can see a nice recovery. I don't know if it'll be such a V-shape. Another concern that I have is really innovation, that we're in a new world. We can adapt to it. In principle, it's not difficult. But who's going to be the pioneers? Who are going to be the first schools to open, the first stores to open, the first factories to open, and try, with trial and error, figure out how to do things in this new world? There's going to be an incentive for everyone to wait and, well, let my competitor figure it out the hard way, and I'll just copy the good stuff that
not
he
be the first out the door.
Pardon me?
Isn't there an advantage in being the first out of the door?
Maybe you could enhance your brand, but you're taking a risk. Some of your people will get sick.
Yeah.
Because by definition, innovation is going to involve failures, right? If there were no failures, then it would be easy, and everyone would rather wait and let others make those failures. So that's a concern that I have. Now we do have the whole world in the same situation, so maybe it doesn't take many brave souls to go out there and try things that we can all learn from. But that's one reason I think it won't be just, on August 1st, we just will not zoom back to where we were. People will take time to adjust, even if the government's not forcing them to stay home. A number of them will.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to bother for a moment. Just for sound quality issues, I think it's good that when someone is not speaking, they should mute themselves and then unmute themselves when they ask a question, because some people are complaining about sound issues. That's all.
All right.
Okay.
All right. So so if I understand you correctly, in your view, some of the federal assistance is actually encouraging people to stay home, not go back working. I wanted to ask you about, Fed Chair Jerome Powell's interview, I think, yesterday, where we stressed the need for more fiscal stimulus in order to avoid an even more severe recession. Do you agree about with this take?
Let me say that I'm not sure where he's coming from. Does that mean disagreement? I mean, fundamentally, if we're only doing 70% of what we used to, we're not going to have a lot of things that we used to. I don't really see how the government printing up checks changes that situation. In particular, when the checks are actually encouraging more people not to do what they used to. I don't see how it's going to happen. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a role for policy. You know, I kind of go back to kind of an old University of Washington view, Doug North view, property rights. And it relates to what I said about innovation. It's not, we're in a new situation and the property rights aren't quite settled yet. And the government can help with that. I think one thing our Senate at least is considering is some liability rules and clarifying, you know, who's liable if somebody gets sick at work or at school. Is it the school? Is it the student? How is that going to work? And that's the type of thing in principle government could be good at. And that would have the effect of getting people back to work and shortening the recession. So maybe Powell had that in mind. I'm not sure the details, but printing checks and deriving formulas for who gets the checks and how big they are, I don't see much recovery coming out of that, if any recovery coming out of that.
Amiram?
Amiram, you're on mute. Amiram, you're on mute.
Right. Sorry. Just following up on this latest question, how do you assess the way the administration is handling this crisis, and given the unprecedented steps that the government has taken to support the economy, do you think this involvement will have a long-term impact on the markets, or is it something that will pass when this whole crisis is over?
You know, I saw two parts to your question. The first part about the administration response, and second part about the markets. If you meant stock markets, who knows? That's
certainly one issue, but not just the markets.
That has a weak tie to the economy in general. But the administration response I can speak to. I mean, this is not new, what they're doing, and I got to see it up close. Health policy and health regulation is really done and has been done going way back, and it hasn't really changed a whole lot without regard to the costs that are created. The health policy makers, they have a mission. For a while, the mission was to have as many people as possible with health insurance, and they're going to pursue that mission, and they're not really interested or are going to track what is their pursuit of that mission costing families and businesses in America. That even though they're required to track that, they don't. And we saw that with Obamacare. We saw that with the opioid epidemic, which is very poorly handled. But again, they're not making any effort to track what their rules cost people who have to follow them. And we're in another situation here where they're talking about, well, let's close down the colleges. Let's advise various businesses to be closed. And they haven't even begun, even though they're required to determine what that costs. So the administration continues that. Now that elected officials, and I write about this in my book, the elected officials have to face the people in a way that the other government employees don't. You know, there's only two elected officials in the administrative branch, and that's Trump and Pence. And all the others don't have to face the voters. And They do, and so they become aware of the costs, maybe in a crude way, but at least they're aware of it. And so I'm not surprised at all to see the president and the vice president at least acknowledging the tremendous cost that people are experiencing in a way that none of the health officials acknowledge. And then it becomes a challenge that the elected official, can he encourage the policy people in the health area to acknowledge the costs that are real? And this is a challenge. I mean, the regulatory officials are career people, and the elected officials are there on a temporary basis. That's almost the definition of democracy. And this is a struggle that is happening right now and has been happening for a number of years.
You mentioned the healthcare issue. This is something we intended to ask you about, so we'll move straight to that question. I mean, the U.S., taking a more long-term view, the U.S. has the highest national expenditure per capita on healthcare among the developed economies, and it seems that the epidemic has demonstrated the shortcomings of its health system. So what should be done about it?
I'm a little surprised about your second premise.
Okay.
You know, one of the things that is of a lot of interest, maybe it's been overemphasized, but people are interested in, so let's talk about it, which is the number of hospital beds per person. Naturally, the U.S. is a bigger country, so it has more of everything, but on a per person basis, number of hospital beds, the number of intensive care hospital beds, U.S. is way ahead of the world on that. And that's part of what we were paying for with all that extra money. And gee, it came in handy, or it could come in handy. You know, Israel is actually ahead of much of the world too, but they had about a third per person intensive care beds. I said Israel, I meant Italy. Italy, where they had a problem with the limit on beds. Well, we had triple the intensive care beds that they have, and they're actually quite a bit ahead of some other places. Spain, for example. I don't know the Israeli numbers, I'm sorry, but so we got something for what we paid for. And that's not the only instance. That's the instance that's of interest right now. If you look at what we spend on cancer treatment, it's a lot more than other countries spend, but you look at how Americans do when they are diagnosed and a tumor is found of a certain size, how long do you survive in the United States versus elsewhere in the world? And it's quite a bit longer. So we pay more, we're getting more in certain dimensions. Now there's a lot of waste, and the opioid area is an area where we spent a lot of money and didn't make people healthier. The opposite, life expectancy went down. So there's certainly rooms for improvement.
Okay, so I might have picked the wrong example with the current epidemic, but is there a way that you see to decrease this health expenditure, or do you think it's something that is not likely?
Yeah, well, one thing that we worked on, what we called choice, and the president called choice and competition. There's a lot of areas in U.S. healthcare. It may be true internationally as well. I don't know so much of the industry details, but in the United States, a lot of healthcare is monopolized. Emergency room doctors, there's really only one or two places that a hospital can go to shop for those, so to speak. And that allows them to charge a lot. You know, where I live in Illinois, where I am right now in Illinois, if you're a hospital and you want to add beds, we talked about the beds earlier, you want to add beds, you have to get all your competitors to approve that. That's unbelievable. You know, if McDonald's wanted to open a new McDonald's location, they don't have to ask Burger King and Wendy's if it's okay. But in healthcare in Illinois and many other states, you have to do that. And we kind of spelled out those problems and proposed some solutions. Now, a lot of those solutions require states. You know, that's an Illinois rule, not a federal rule. But the president was looking at, well, is there ways that he can punish Illinois until Illinois fixes that problem? Or is there a way that he could reward Illinois when they do fix that problem? And so competition is a factor. We did tackle it in prescription drugs, and it was amazingly effective. I was a little surprised, even myself. actually, there's an Israeli connection here, so maybe I'm getting myself in trouble, but there's a company called Teva, Teva, that makes generic. But one thing they've done really well at is selling generic versions of drugs. So these are drugs that are off patent. And for one reason or another, they were one of the few companies to get FDA approval, got US government approval to sell those generic drugs. And so they were able to charge a lot. And what President Trump did when he came into office, he said, wait a second, we can't be having, but this is a generic drug. It's been around for years and years. We know all about it. There should be lots of companies that would be making that drug, not just Teva, and there's a couple Chinese companies in that situation. And so the FDA kind of stepped out of the way and allowed much more competition in the generic drug area. And we saw prescription drug prices in the United States fall for the first time in 46 years. And last I looked, when I left the White House, prescription drug prices were about 12% below the previous trend. And that was very clear that a big part of that came from enhanced competition, as you would expect from an economic perspective, but it was pretty cool to see it actually play out in real time.
Right.
So, since you mentioned Trump, could you tell us a little bit about, how you ended up working for the administration?
I'm sure a factor was that I had written a book about the so-called stimulus in 2009 that didn't stimulate. It actually made the recovery slower. And I had written another book about the health reform that Republicans called Obamacare. I'd written a book about how that was slowing the recovery. So I was more or less an expert on critiquing the previous administration's policies. So I imagine that's something that they liked. I mean, they didn't ring me up and say that as much. Also, I had done work on regulation, and regulation is one of these areas now today that all of America is aware of health regulations because they're stuck in their homes because of such regulations. But regulation was kind of this area that many, even academics, weren't familiar with, and I was familiar with it, and that was, I'd call it the president's top priority. Maybe he would dispute that, and he would want to say there's a tie for first among many things. But it's amazing what he did in regulation, and he needed people who were familiar with that and were eager to become more familiar with it.
So could you, so we are observers from far away, right? We're a long way from Washington. Could you give us a taste, some glimpse of how does it feel working from inside the White House? What was the experience like?
Before I started working there, I was where you were. I was in Israel for a bit, but I was outside the White House, and just everything I knew was coming from New York Times, more or less, or television, which you see. And I knew I had an advantage, and I knew that stuff's not true, because I'd worked a lot on Obamacare, and I would just see things in the New York Times that just were totally untrue about Obamacare. But still, I was very nervous because I was hearing all these terrible stories, and I knew they weren't true. But then, what is true? And I was kind of nervous about that. And I learned when I got there, a number of people felt like me. They knew what they were hearing wasn't true, but they weren't sure what would be true. And when I got there, I really had a great time. The president was amazing person. I just loved just listening to him and taking notes and learning. It's like I was like a student again in that regard. But all the people that were working for him were really impressive people. And one kind of funny thing is, given the audience today, I'm not sure I've seen so many libertarians in one building since I went to the Mont Pelerin Society meetings about 30 years ago, which is a society devoted to libertarians. There are more libertarians in the White House than there are at any single university, I would say, in the world. And so that's kind of interesting. And we really, I really enjoyed working with them. I mean, and they were very respectful to me, appreciating what talents I brought, and I appreciated the talents they brought. We had different talents, and there wasn't anybody there just like me, and vice versa. So I really, it was sad. It was sad to come home. Although I'm glad I'm not there now, because I would be trapped. You're not allowed to leave Washington without going to 2-week quarantine. So,
wow.
But it was sad. I didn't know that was coming. So when I had to come home, it was sad.
Could you say something? Could you tell us a little about Trump's economic thinking, his worldview, and we're wondering if he can be labeled as a pro-market, capitalist, populist, you know, or is it irrelevant in his case?
He's a smart person, but I don't see him as ideological. Maybe he is deep down, but he certainly doesn't show an ideology. He certainly acts as a populist. I mean, he knows where his power comes from, and he knows it comes from a place that other presidents hadn't come from there, which is from the people. The people in Washington do not like him, right? And they don't get along. Even a lot of the Republicans are not totally enthralled with him. And so he knows it. If he doesn't have the people on his side, then he's got nothing. He knows that very well. And so everything comes back to that in his mind. And in all the policies that we work on, he always went back to what did I promise the people in the campaign? How am I doing on that promise? He never forgot about those things. And you had the impeachment and all these different things in Washington, kind of attacking him from the Washington perspective. And he always knew that the people is where it comes from. And even regarding the pandemic now, you know, I think he had a view that we need to get back to work, but he wasn't ready to express that view very much until the people were ready to express that view. And so that's why it was important when he started seeing some of the protests, then he started speaking up, because he knew that Washington would flatten him. If he said something like that without the people supporting him, Washington would run him right over. Washington is not interested in getting back to work, but the people are. A lot of people are.
But you know, we had Dr. Fauci warning yesterday, I think, that, you know, loosening restrictions too soon could have very serious effects. I take it you disagree.
No, it would have very serious effects. We're choosing between the lesser of evils. And actually, he's required. I was quite disappointed when he said he doesn't pay attention to the economics, it's not his area. Actually, he's required by the Office of Management and Budget to keep track of the costs of his guidance and his regulations. And he was very open with the Senate. I was actually wondering, does he even know that he's required to do that? But life is trade-offs. And he's going to sit there and pretend there's not trade-offs, or he doesn't have to care about the trade-offs. There are trade-offs in between health and other things, or certain types of health, or health of different groups. These are all trade-offs, and nobody can make a decision without considering those trade-offs. If you do, it's a disaster. And I think that's kind of where we are. And the president is very different from Fauci in that regard, that he's got both sides of the trade-off presented to him in his mind. And the people do too have both sides of the trade-off in their minds. So I think you have the people in Trump. Not all people like Trump, but an awful lot of people understand both sides of that trade-off. And Fauci just wants to obsess on one. And I totally disagree with that. And he's breaking the rules for what it's worth.
You touched on populism, and this brings us to your book. Actually, I noticed one interesting point that you made, and that's, and I quote, "Today's populism has some real substance, in it. Did you mention? Did you want to refer to the regulation problem, or what is behind this assertion?
Yeah, one of the I think a lot of the regulation that President Trump took out. For example, I'm looking right now literally at 1 trillion gallons of fresh water, Lake Michigan. Okay, but the previous president will not allow me to have a dishwasher that would use more than 2 of those gallons to wash my dishes. So my dishwasher takes 6 hours. And this is not glamorous, right? But everyone has to wash dishes, and that you would add 10 minutes to my family's day because I can't use 2 gallons of that 1 trillion gallons right there. That's outrageous. But Washington thought it was cool. There was some environmental bragging that they could make. I'm not sure what, because there's 1 trillion of those gallons over there. I just want 2 of them for my dishes, and I'll put it back. They didn't care, and Trump supporters do care about that. And Trump even talked about making dishwashers great again. So that's an example, maybe not so glamorous. More dramatic example is the opioid epidemic, that Washington totally ignored that. The Bush administration did some things to fuel it. The Obama administration totally ignored it. And that's not something that the people were ignoring. This is a priority to people. It was bothersome to them. They wanted something to do about it. And the powers in Washington were doing nothing. And that's what I consider the substance of populism, that the people had real complaints. This wasn't conspiracy theory, that the opioid epidemic is not a conspiracy theory. It's a real thing that bothered real people. And Washington didn't want to make it a priority, but President Trump very much made it a priority.
Well, these are the easier parts, but would you go all the way with this argument with regard to trade agreements?
There was real people in significant numbers who have suffered from international competition. These are real people, and they're allowed to vote, and they should be allowed to vote.
Right.
How you want to weigh that, and of course, Adam Smith and others have their view on those things. But if we live in a democracy and you're going to ignore big chunks of the population, don't get surprised when you don't win the election. And the president is oriented toward that. Now, I think he's done a good job at kind of redirecting some of that frustration in more productive ways, like the intellectual property problem with particularly the country of China. I think all sides, even economists who really don't like our president, acknowledge many times that intellectual property is a serious problem, and he's kind of directed some of that trade frustration in that direction. A lot like Reagan did, and I have a chapter in the book about really the Reagan-Trump similarities are much more than you'd ever guess, based on their rhetoric in terms of their actions. This is one thing that Reagan, back then it was Japan and not China, but Reagan, by the time Reagan made it a priority to deal with intellectual property internationally. It took him 5 or 6 or 7 years to do it, but by his second term, Reagan was able to get some agreements on intellectual property in East Asia. And I see President Trump on a very similar path. In fact, he has a lot of Reaganites sitting in the White House right now. The trade advisor for Trump was the second in command trade advisor for Reagan.
But it seems he was more pro-international trade than the current president is.
In rhetoric, yes. I think I assigned my students a YouTube of Ronald Reagan giving a speech about demagoguery and tariffs and the beauties of free trade. It's one of the most beautiful YouTubes I've ever seen on any topic and on trade. It brings tears to your eyes to watch it. But then you look at what Ronald Reagan actually did, okay? And Ronald Reagan did quota after quota after quota, which is even worse than a tariff. One way to think about an import quota versus a tariff is both of them reduce the amount of imports. But the tariff, at least our treasury gets the money. Who gets the money from a quota? The foreign producers. And people in the Reagan administration, after I gave them chapters of that chapter of my book, they said, you know, Casey, I'll tell you a little secret. When I was in the White House in Reagan, the Japanese company actually came to us and asked, please give us a quota. And Reagan gave it to him. And Reagan was, you know, why was he doing that? It's not that he was dumb. He didn't understand the virtues of free trade, right? He's got the best YouTube on the topic. But he was sensitive. For example, he wanted to win Michigan. Ronald Reagan wanted to win Michigan in the election. And Donald Trump wanted to win Michigan in the election. The sort of interest groups that were at play in the Reagan administration are very similar to the ones that are at the table now. So there's a lot of similarities in actions. And that's what I try to cover in the book. What are the actions? The rhetoric is different. And I talk about how the rhetoric is different, and that's a pretty fun topic. But when you get down to the substance, I think Reagan restricted trade just as much as Trump did, and he harmed the Americans more.
Really?
That's why he didn't have a trade war with Japan, because he was paying the Japanese companies not to fight back, right? And at least our president now is not doing that. He's not paying the Japanese companies. And so then the Japanese companies the Chinese companies. Chinese companies are not getting paid. So they want a trade war. So it's very interesting.
So could we, ask you about, is there an intellectual journey here? I mean, I don't want to label you, right? But, on one hand, you talk about the president's, the president's listening to the people and what the people want. This is coming from, you went to Harvard, went to the University of Chicago, you teach at the University of Chicago. It's one of the most elite, educational institutions in the world. So, not
Amen,
necessarily
brother.
associated with the people.
I agree with you. And I discussed this in the book. It was a journey for me. I mean, it was more of an eye-opening for me. I've been teaching economics my entire career. And of course I get frustrated. I might make fun of a politician who talks on TV and gets economics backwards, and I like, this person doesn't know economics, and they don't. I mean, it's not their job to pass an economics test. But what I really appreciated very quickly was that we intellectuals are not accountable. And when we make mistakes, by not being accountable, we have trouble even acknowledging them, let alone fixing them. And what I appreciate about the elected officials, not that they're more virtuous people, but in the situation that they're in, namely they have to deal with the people and get their vote and their approval, that they bring a lot of value to the table. And I really appreciate the elected officials in a way that I never had before. I must confess, maybe I look down on them a little bit, but they're bringing something very important to the table.
Yeah.
Let's try and squeeze some behind the scene insight. Going back to your book, I read that you promise, and I quote, to provide some rigorous evidence on the assertion that the White House staff is in perpetual chaos. Can you share with us a little of that evidence?
Yes. I think the one we could do in the shortest amount of time would be in terms of chaos. What is the opposite of chaos? Is predictability.
Okay.
Chaos is unpredictable. And I can understand people on the outside, especially if you don't read my book and understand how our president operates, things seem unpredictable. I understand that it seems that way, but actually things are very predictable. And one example that I give is my own work that I did there. I had a one-year plan for what I would do in the White House when I got there. And I talked to my bosses about it on the third day. And I said, these are the 8 things I think I could help with in a year. And they said, yeah, let's do it. And the plan more or less went according to plan. How could I be in a chaotic place and be able to execute a plan that was hatched at the beginning of the year? Things happened in a very predictable way. We talked earlier about the deregulating the drug and the drug prices. I mean, that when the data finally came out on the drug prices, we were prepared 6 months ahead of that data coming out. We knew that this is what happens when you remove barriers to entry, the prices fall. And so things were very predictable. We were very productive. The other part of the chaos people say is that, oh, supposedly everyone who works for the president can't get their job done because they're so busy cleaning up the spoiled brat's mess. That's what some books have said about him. But by any metric, you look at how productive my group was, and you know, the economic group. I'm not a foreign policy or a State Department person, but in the economic area, which is not a trivial area, we were more productive than our group had been in any other presidency. We had done more analyses of regulation than all the previous administrations put together. We had analyzed pandemics before this pandemic came. And I have a number of metrics in the book, the amount that our economic group was able to publish and analyze and achieve. And it's far ahead of anyone in the past. And that's because, you know, I'd like to say that my group is they're great geniuses, but I'm proud of our group, but it's our president. He was very supportive, and he created an environment where things were predictable and we could be productive and really do our job in an efficient and productive way. And the people who say that there's chaos in the White House, you know, what do they point to? A lot of them point to no evidence at all. They just say it. That's fine. Now, one thing they point to would be the turnover. They say, well, look at the turnover and Obama versus Reagan. And I go through some of the cases. So let's look at some of Obama's people and some of Trump's people. Like, we had the guy in charge of health deregulation, Brian Blaze, in the White House. Of course, the health department works on that too, but in the White House, kind of point man for that. He was in the Trump administration for only 29 months. Why? Because he accomplished everything he was supposed to accomplish in 29 months. Then it's time to move on, right? And you look at somebody like Ben Rhodes, who was in the Obama White House for all 8 years. Why was that? Because 6 years went by and he hadn't accomplished anything. And he needed the full 8 years to, you know, finish the president's priorities. And so that, I think you got to be careful on those turnover statistics. I think turnover can also often be an indicator of productivity, that you're getting your job done in a timely fashion. And then it's time to go on and do different things like I'm doing now, or for new people to come in to take on new things because the old things are finished.
We are running out of time, and I wanted to ask you something about a visit we had this week. Based on your intimate knowledge of the administration, we had Secretary of State Mike Pompeo coming over, and he seemed to have expressed the concern of the administration about the economic ties Israel has developed with China. Now, I imagine you don't want to get any specific about the case of Israel, but speaking in general, how much is Washington concerned about this developments?
I mean, it kind of career Washington people, there's a lot of vested interest in China. I mean, and so there a lot of Washington wants to keep things the way they are and don't want to change it all. Now, the president in particular, and a number of people in the White House, they view their job as trying something new. That what was done in the past can be improved upon, and you need to try some things. I think an area where that worked really well, despite tons of skepticism in Washington, was on the arrangement for international post offices. We had a ridiculous arrangement for decades where it actually costs more to ship something from Chicago to Arizona or from Arizona to Chicago than it was to bring it from China to Chicago. Ridiculous system. And the president threatened to withdraw from that international organization. Of course, there was horror everywhere in Washington. But in the end, the organization caved and said, okay, we'll do what's sensible, and we'll have postal fees that are more in line with what things are worth and what they cost. And the U.S. is still in that organization, but it took a threat to withdraw. And so I would expect there's more of that ahead. There's more of these international organizations that can do better, and they won't do better unless they're put under some heavy pressure. And I'd expect the president to deliver some of that pressure.
Just one last thing before we open up. You seem to have picked an interesting background. Would you like to say anything about what's behind you?
Since, as we discussed, the health department's required to track the costs of its regulations, and it's not. So I took it upon myself to track the costs of the pandemic, not just the regulations around the pandemic, but the pandemic as a whole. And so I have a website. Every day it's updated, pandemiccosts.com. And I track, how many opportunities were lost to trade and learn and things like that today, and how much was lost in terms of health, especially mortality today. Those are the two colors, the red and the blue. And that updates every day. It actually has a little ticker every 2.5 seconds. It has a little bit of an update, but the serious update I do every night, every evening here in Chicago.
Right.
Right.
Great.
Elchanan, so my final question, if I may, I just, before we leave, I wanted to leave, the areas of policy and, day-to-day running of the country, and ask you a more intellectual question. Last year, Tyler Cowen from George Mason University, whom I think you're familiar with, he was also a guest of the Friedberg Economics Institute, and I had the opportunity to talk to him. And one of his, one striking thing he said was that, these days, the intellectual energy is with the left, as he sees it. That, on the right, libertarians are, going out of fashion today, and the ethno-nationalists, as he put it, have the day. And since you mentioned the White House staffed with libertarians, I was wondering what you thought about his assertion.
I can't really speak to the political realm.
It was more of an intellectual observation.
On campuses, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
Which would, not all intellectuals on a campus, but let's say on campuses. Sure. Yes, I've seen that. I attribute it to kind of technological change that during my lifetime, there's been information technology has really improved, and that's especially shown up as an empirical analysis and data gathering. And that's a very welcome thing. But as a result, the people trained in our profession are paying less attention to somewhat more theoretical issues like, why does central planning not work? What is an equilibrium? How does a market fit together? And the interest is more in the data collection and in questions of causality, and how to deal with that statistically, which are great questions. But I see the technology kind of pushing a bigger share of academics into that activity and away from the more theoretical, the way Milton Friedman was, a very good theorist as well as data gathering. And that's because the technology in his day favored theory a little bit. Data was expensive, regressions were expensive. And so he and his colleagues spent more time on theoretical type of questions.
Interesting. All right, this has been fascinating. Hananel, I think over to you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Uri and Miriam, you're welcome to stay with us if you want to listen to the Q&A. I just wanted to start off with the Q&A with my own question, which is basically related to how we titled the talk, which is how much is the Corona crisis going to cost us, and how are we going to finance it? And we also asked, how is the recovery going to look like? I think even Globes published, they translated Wall Street Journal article talking about the Nike-shaped recovery. So you probably have a lot what to say about that. And that'll be the first question. And after that, we'll turn over to the audience.
You know, the cost in the United States, I estimate it's about $250 a day per household cost compared to a normally functioning economy. And that's going to last for every day that this lasts. This is one of the reasons why I'm a little discouraged by the idea, well, let's just hunker down and if we're just making this last longer, that's $250 a day for every extra day we're adding here. There's a lot of value to getting it done. And I would think in Israel, it'd be a similar sort of number. I haven't studied there, but it'd be something on that order of $100 or $200 a day per household. Now, what is it going to take to get back to normal? Innovation. But I take a broader view of innovation than just discovering a vaccine. That would be nice. Or discovering treatments. Innovation, just like the costs behind me are the medical part is the blue and the economic part is the red. Innovation is largely in the red. I mean, just figuring out how to run a business or a college in a new world in a way that still delivers a lot of what people would like and need. That's innovation, and it's mundane and it's not glamorous, but that's what's needed, and eventually we'll get it. But the quicker we get it, the better. I mean, it's, as I said, $250 a day a household. That's the why we're in a hurry.
Yeah. Okay, so our next question will be from Ariel. Ariel, if you want, you can turn on your. Okay, please turn on your sound.
Hi.
Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Wait, I wrote it, so.
I thought you remembered it.
It's gone. Okay, so my question was, in the entire Western world, maybe just the outliers are South Korea and Japan. In the last few decades, there has been a large decrease in hospital beds in the US, in Sweden, in Denmark, in Israel, in Germany. Do you think that was a net positive or a net negative? Did that save lives or hurt lives, and did we overshoot at it? It's partly due to the Romer effect that occupancy does go up as you increase the amount of beds, but it is a trend that we see in the entire Western world. So I was wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Well, there's been a lot of technological change in health and the pharmaceuticals. We mentioned Tevi. I mean, they're a big part of supplying the world with pharmaceuticals. So there's a lot of treatments now that can be done without a hospital visit. And certainly that's a factor. Now there's a risk that we might have wished we had those hospital beds in the past in the current pandemic. Now, so far that hasn't really, we haven't really run out of hospital beds in the United States. Now the pandemic's not over, and maybe we will. And in that case, at least in hindsight, you would say you wish you had more of those beds. You know, and why were the beds cut down? Other than the technological change, I mentioned in Illinois, what we do, to have another hospital bed, your competitors have to approve. And of course, they don't approve. So there's a lot of anti-competitive factors that have limited hospital beds in the United States, let me say.
Okay, thank you. Bob, you're welcome to ask.
Okay. So if you were talking about the Obama stimulus, so we had that in 2008, 2009. Then Trump was elected. We started recovery, but the debt that was accumulated during those 8 years under Obama as a percentage of GDP is there. It almost doubled in his administration. Now we're layering huge new amounts onto this. We're seeing projections of debt in the United States reaching 150% of GDP. What does this mean, Casey? I mean, how do you deal with this? Can all this spending, can all this new debt be something that can be overcome and return to a normal, prosperous economy?
You know, in any market I look at the price and the quantity. So the quantity, you were speaking about the quantity of debt, which has certainly gone up a lot, for sure. Now, what about the price? I mean, U.S. government debt is still a very expensive thing to buy. Now, maybe that's going to change, but, and this is really Milton Friedman wrote the early paper, if not the pioneering paper on it. He called it the optimum quantity of money, really discussing the government liabilities in general, not just pieces of paper with presidents' faces on them. But his view was that, you know, if the government liabilities are expensive, there's not enough of them. So I always kind of lean toward having more debt. Now, what are you going to spend it on when you issue more debt? Hopefully you're going to spend it on wise things and not unwise things. So I tend to focus more on the spending. And I will say I'm very disappointed in the spending in the current stimulus. It shouldn't be called a stimulus. It's anti-stimulus, or let me call it a relief package, because I understand the intentions might have been to give relief to people, because these costs, this $250 a day is not evenly distributed among people.
So how would you do it differently?
I would have had the unemployment benefits, probably have more federal management of them, because one of the problems we're having now is getting the unemployment benefits is itself a full-time job. The states are overwhelmed. And I would have had some federal control over that, and they'd be a lower amount. The people who are out of work receiving unemployment benefits would make somewhat less than they make while working. Not starvation. I don't want them to starve or anywhere close to that. But there should be a little something in it for them when they and their companies figure out ways to get back to work.
Bob, are you done?
I could go on, but I want others to have a chance.
Okay, we are open for more questions. If anybody has any more questions, please raise your hand or open your video or ask in text. Oh, I see Shai has a question. Okay, go ahead, Shai.
I potentially have a question. So the whole time you've been talking about sort of there are two elements of what is causing the loss, and there are the regulations, the shutdown imposed by the government, and then there's the actual pandemic itself. And from what it sounds like, you are looking for more for recovery driven by innovation to deal with the situation which we have from the pandemic itself, rather than just the government getting rid of all the regulations. So I was wondering if you might agree that it might actually be better if the government sort of was more clear about putting on the restrictions even for longer, so that would give more of an incentive and more room for the innovation to deal with the fact that you have a pandemic and it's a different world.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you for that question. There's two sorts of regulations. There's the regulations, the stay-at-home sort of regulations. But there are also regulations about how innovation can be done and approved, which are very important. That's one of the major, especially in health. The regulatory hurdles are as much as the scientific hurdles. And so my encouragement is there for them to get out of the way of innovation in the medical area and in the business area. People have had a chance to just sit at home and think about how they're going to do things different when they get back to work. I'm not sure there's much more to be had from that thought process. I think they actually have to be in work and have some failures. You know, when you're just sitting at home and theorizing without doing, there are no failures, right? Everything seems like a great idea. And you need the failures. And that's one reason I'm disappointed by some of the stay-at-home orders, that they're making it illegal for some of this progress to be made.
Shai, was that a?
Thanks. That's good.
Okay. Please, we are happy to take more questions. Moment. Okay. All right. If we have no more questions, we can wrap up.
Let me ask one.
Okay. Bob, go ahead.
So on your whole important point about innovation and creativity, Casey, isn't the way they're handling this PPP program and the other money that's going to these businesses to allegedly help them accomplishing completely the opposite? If you take a look at the PPP spending, which we're talking $650 billion, something like that, what are they doing? They're going in and they're saying to these companies, we'll lend you this money, but you do what we tell you to do. The government's telling them how to run their businesses.
Yeah.
And what are they doing? They're saying, we'll give it to you if you staff up exactly the way you were before. We're in a crisis, you know, and we've got companies that have 10 employees, companies that have 500 employees, and they're telling them, run your company by the same rules. You got dry cleaners, restaurants, whatever. These are completely different businesses. You know, how in the world can you possibly have innovation when you have government giving them huge amounts of money and essentially telling them, don't change and run your business the way government is telling you to do it?
Yeah, I teach a class on the economics of socialism. One of the things we talk about, and some of my left-leaning colleagues tease me for even having such a class, but we've seen that in central planning. The central planners, they don't do well, but the thing they do least badly is telling you to do what you did before. and in fact, if you try to do something different than you did before, it's in their interest to stop you from doing that, because that just makes their life more complicated as a planner. So central planning is certainly the enemy of innovation. And I think one instinct I think the president had was to try to get some of the stuff out of the federal government and put in the state's hands. Now you still have central planning within the state. But yeah, central planning and innovation do not mix. And we saw that in the Soviet Union. They just fell further and further behind as the world progressed and discovered things. Soviet Union could not take on the new ideas. And now we're at a time where we need stuff soon, measured in days and weeks and not years. Innovation is of the essence.
You know, I would also raise the issue of Dr. Fauci, if I'm saying his name correctly. You know, somebody raised the issue of his remarks yesterday, the day before. Now, how in the world can this doctor be making announcements in Washington about whether the country should shut down or not? I mean, for one thing, we're talking about a country of 300 million people, 50 states. The New York and Maine and South Dakota have absolutely nothing in common except they've got American citizens living in them. How can anybody, let alone this physician, be talking about one policy, okay, coming out of Washington about whether the country should shut down or not? Is this not absurd?
Yeah, it is beyond absurd. And I talk about this in my central planning classes. It's like, at least the Soviet Union was primarily agricultural, and then life was kind of simple. You look at the number of prices that are set in Dr. Fauci's agency by government, they probably exceed the number of prices that is set in all the Soviet Union by the Politburo. So it's absurd, but central planning, and this is why I teach the class, central planning is compelling. It's a disaster, right? But it's compelling. You can hear it in the news, right? Well, we need somebody who has a plan. The governor of New York, he's got a plan. I mean, we have a generation of people who never heard the phrase 5-year plan and the terror that came with such things. You know, humans flourish without a central plan. They flourish on, you know, understanding their personal situations and fitting in with those around them. So the opportunities for teaching here, if there's a bright side, are plentiful.
I think we have one last question from Ariel. It's a second question, but I'm giving Ariel. Oh, we have 2 follow-up questions. Well, we'll see after Ariel's question if we have time for another one, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, Ariel, go ahead.
Yes, hi, and thank you for the opportunity to ask another one. Casey, you said that people who are hurt by international trade should be taken into account, but doesn't the same argument hold for those who are in labor unions, or those who worry about inequality, or those who worry about technology or are displaced by technology? It seems to suggest that what you think the optimal policy is a Luddite optimal policy, and from what I know in economics, that's not true.
No, I'm not calling it optimal policy. I'm calling it democracy. That's all I'm calling it. If you have a system in which all the people get a say, then you're going to have some of these things. And if you don't want some of these things, you're going to need a system where all the people don't get a say. But that's got its own problems. So.
But you are critical when people express Luddite opinions, but you are not as critical as people who express anti-international trade opinions. And I don't understand the difference.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by critical. I just like to get the facts straight, that like we're doing what Reagan did, except a little better, but it's not what Adam Smith would do, not even close. I think those are the facts.
Okay, thank you.
And you know, I found it work well to encourage when they were doing a good job. So the deregulation I view as free trade within the country. You know, I wouldn't put it that way because the anti-free traders might be against deregulation for that reason. But to the extent we have deregulation, I think we got a lot of it. We have freer trade within the country, and that's a nice start.
Okay, thank you, Ariel. Shai, please ask your follow-up question, and then, okay, go ahead.
Hi. So we were just talking to Bob right beforehand about the absurdity of having a centralized policy in Washington for what should be done in the whole country. But I've seen a challenge to that, which is that with the pandemic, because of the nature of how it all works, in order to really have different policies for different places, you would have to kind of first have travel restrictions. Because as long as there are no travel restrictions, and people from New York City, for example, are traveling around everywhere as they do normally, then you do have a sort of a national problem, which which doesn't enable to have different policies. I'm wondering if you would support or agree that if you have having travel restrictions, perhaps federally imposed travel restrictions, well, I'm not sure that's legally possible, in order to then enable different states, different counties to have different policies.
I totally agree with you that there are externalities, and these externalities do not automatically respect state borders, for example. I agree with that. Where I want us to be careful is we don't go straight from externalities to central planning. And again, I try to use the data on this. How did the Soviet Union do? Soviet Union had central planning. How'd they do on dealing with externalities? I think the conclusion has been that they were actually worse on externalities. Even though in principle, on paper, when you're centrally planning, you don't have externality problems, right? And one of the things that we saw there is by not having prices for so many things, or given that they were setting prices, they tried to make the number of prices in the country small. There weren't prices on a lot of things. When you don't have prices, that creates externalities where there don't need to be any. And so I worry that our government will create more externalities than it solves. And you see at least there's talk, I don't know if there's action on the price gouging regulations, that you can't price gouge. Well, say you're removing prices, you're actually creating externalities. People who increase the supply of the things you can't gouge, whether it be face masks or protective materials or whatever, ventilators, the people who produce those things and do them in a timely way, in a high quality way, are now in a transaction has an externality because they're not compensated. So this is a concern. I actually have a question for you guys. Do we have time for that?
Sure, 100%.
It's a teaching kind of question. I mean, it comes up in my class and we talk about central planning, and then I like to look at the data. How does central planning work? What things didn't go well? And then I'll point out things that didn't go well. And I'll do this in the United States as well. But in the Soviet Union, they had the farms were taken over by the government, and then the managers of the farms were government employees who might have been from the city, and they didn't know the difference between a cow and a horse. And I always get the question from the students, and I have trouble answering it, which is, that's fine, just next time make sure that the farmers are running the farms and not the city people. And so whenever you point out a mistake with central planning, the reaction by some of the audience is, that's not a problem with central planning, just next time don't make that mistake. And I wondered if you guys have a good way of extending that conversation. I know you guys have taught classes on markets and freedom. And this has been a challenge for me.
Bob?
I don't know. To tell you the truth, I really didn't understand what you're asking, Casey. Could you just summarize it again?
So on the question of central planning, we want to be empirical. I would like to point out big mistakes that central planners made.
Yeah.
And then I always have some students who say, that's not a problem with central planning. Just next time, tell the central planner not to make that mistake.
I guess what I would say is that reply misses the point. The issue is not what the individuals do. The issue is the rules of the game. When you get the right rules of the game, then people do respond to incentives. So the issue is not who, but what. And the issue is the rules and getting the rules right. I worked in Washington many years myself, and I saw it all the time. People think that the problem is you have the wrong people. If we had different people, then with different qualifications or whatever, things would be different. And it's simply not true. It has nothing to do with it. It's not to minimize the importance of good people, but you need the right system and you need the right rules, and then you get the right results.
Good.
All right.
Thanks, Bob.
I think we all really enjoyed this. So we got some inside information from the White House, and we talked about Corona and about regulation and deregulation. And thank you, Amiram and Uri. You're muted, but you're welcome to say goodbye. And I would also plug Casey's book on behalf of them. Casey is putting out a book this coming September, and you can already pre-order on Amazon, and hopefully by the time September comes, you would also get free shipping to Israel. We'll find out. Right now, I don't know if you heard, all the shipping to Israel from Amazon right now costs $50. So.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, but it was free 2 months ago, but.
Well, if you come to Israel, Casey, you can bring copies of your book.
Yeah. I'll fill up a suitcase. No, I'm going to come for sure.
Okay.
Thanks,
Great.
everyone. Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Okay, good night, everyone. Bye.
Good night. Thank you so much.